What if tomorrow every dollar you have suddenly meant nothing? No cash, no bank, no numbers. And the scariest part isn't losing money. It's what people become without it. What would you do if tomorrow your money became worthless? No cash, no bank, no numbers. Everything you've worked for, gone overnight. Would society collapse, or would we finally become free? Because this already happened. And the truth is more disturbing than you think. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and money no longer exists. Not cash, not bank accounts, not digital wallets. Every number in every system is gone. Your salary is zero. Your savings are zero. Billionaires are no different from you. At first, it feels like a glitch. People check their phones again and again. Banking apps refuse to load. ATMs show errors. Credit cards stop working. Within minutes, confusion spreads across the world. News channels interrupt every program. Governments release emergency statements, but even they don't fully understand what's happening. Stock markets freeze. Trading halts. Financial systems collapse in real time. But the real chaos doesn't begin in the stock exchange. It begins at the supermarket. People rush to buy food, but nothing works. No payment methods. No transactions. At first, some stores try to stay open, hoping systems will come back. But they don't. A strange silence fills the checkout lines. Then comes the first decision. Do you walk out with food without paying? Some hesitate. Some leave everything behind. But others slowly begin to take what they need. Not stealing, they tell themselves. Just surviving. Within hours, the rules of society begin to blur. If money doesn't exist, what does ownership even mean? By the end of the first day, the illusion of control completely disappears. Stores begin to close, not because they want to, but because they have no system left to operate. Employees stop showing up. Why would they work if salaries no longer exist? Delivery trucks stop in the middle of highways. Drivers abandon shipments because there is no longer a contract, no payment, no obligation. Supply chains, once invisible but perfectly synchronized, break apart within hours. Some drivers hesitate before leaving their cargo behind. They sit in silence, realizing that everything they once trusted to define responsibility has vanished. Without a system, even simple decisions become heavy. Hospitals face an impossible question. Doctors still want to help. Nurses still show up. But medicine equipment, fuel, everything depended on a system that no longer exists. Without payment, suppliers stop delivering. Pharmacies run out of drugs. The world realizes something terrifying. Money was never just paper or numbers. It was trust. And now that trust is gone. In some neighborhoods, people begin to cooperate. They share food. They organize small groups. Skills become more valuable than ever. A mechanic can trade repairs for food. A farmer becomes more important than a banker overnight. People start remembering things they once ignored. Who knows how to fix things? Who can grow food? Who can be trusted? Reputation begins forming quietly, not through titles, but through actions. But in other places, things turn darker. Without a shared system of value, conflict rises quickly. Who deserves what? Who decides? Without rules, power begins to shift to those who can take, not those who can earn. Governments try to restore order. They announce temporary systems, rationing, resource distribution, but without a universal way to measure value. Every decision feels unfair to someone. Protests begin, not because people lost money, but because they lost certainty. On the second day, something unexpected happens. Silence. The constant noise of the economy disappears. No stock tickers. No transaction notifications. No price updates. For the first time in modern history, the world stops measuring everything. At first, it feels peaceful. No bills to pay. No debts chasing you. No pressure to earn. People step outside confused but strangely lighter. Some people smile for no clear reason. Others feel a strange anxiety as if something invisible that once guided their lives has disappeared. But that feeling doesn't last long, because without prices, people don't know how to decide anymore. How much is a loaf of bread worth? How much is a doctor's time worth? How much is your life worth? Without money, value becomes subjective, and subjective value leads to disagreement. In some communities, people attempt barter systems. You give something, you get something. Simple, direct, human. But barter has limits. What if you need medicine, but all you have is furniture? What if the other person doesn't want what you offer? Soon people realize that money wasn't just a tool for buying. It was a universal language. And now everyone is speaking different languages. Meanwhile, a new kind of power begins to emerge. Those who control essential resources gain influence. Water, food, energy. These are the new currencies. Not numbers on a screen, but physical control over survival. In certain regions, small leaders rise. Not elected, not chosen by vote, chosen by necessity. A person who can organize food becomes a leader. Someone who can protect a group becomes authority. Society begins to rebuild itself, but in a completely different form. Less about equality, more about survival. By the end of the first week, the world no longer looks familiar. Cities once powered by invisible systems of finance begin to slow down. Traffic lights fail as maintenance stops. Public transport becomes unreliable. Fuel is no longer distributed efficiently. People start walking more. Distances that once felt impossible become normal again. The pace of life slows, but the effort increases. Airports shut down, not because planes can't fly, but because coordination collapses. Pilots, ground staff, air traffic controllers all depended on a structured system of compensation. Without it, priorities shift. Travel becomes a luxury of the past. People stay where they are. Borders lose meaning in some places, but become more dangerous in others. Without international agreements backed by economic consequences, cooperation between nations weakens. Some countries attempt to create a new form of currency: digital credits, resource tokens, government-issued vouchers. But there's a problem. Why should anyone trust it? The memory of money disappearing is still fresh. People hesitate to believe in any system that can vanish overnight. Trust once broken is difficult to rebuild. Meanwhile, a different kind of economy begins to grow. Local economies. Small communities create their own rules, their own systems of exchange. In one town, time becomes currency. 1 hour of work equals 1 unit. In another, food is the standard. In another, protection. There is no global system anymore, only fragments, and those fragments don't always connect. In some regions, peace forms. In others, conflict intensifies. Because when systems collapse, human nature becomes the deciding factor. Are people more cooperative or more selfish? The answer begins to reveal itself. By the second week, a new reality begins to settle in. People stop waiting for money to come back. Hope fades, but adaptation begins. In the absence of a global system, humans do what they've always done throughout history. They rebuild from the ground up. Families become units of survival. Neighbors become allies. Communities become governments. Skills that once felt ordinary now define your worth. A doctor is no longer well paid or underpaid. A doctor is simply necessary. A farmer is no longer part of an industry. A farmer becomes the center of life itself. Meanwhile, entire professions disappear overnight. Stockbrokers, bankers, financial analysts. Their knowledge, once powerful, suddenly has no place in this new world. And that creates a deep psychological shock. For decades, people defined themselves by income status and financial success. Now those identities vanish. A millionaire and a minimum wage worker stand on equal ground, and many don't know who they are anymore. Some try to hold on to their old identity, speaking about past achievements as if they still matter. Others let go slowly, rebuilding a sense of self based on usefulness rather than status. This identity crisis spreads silently. Some people find freedom in it. Others feel completely lost. At the same time, new hierarchies begin to form, not based on money, but based on usefulness. Those who can provide food safety knowledge or organization rise naturally. Leadership becomes practical, not symbolic. But with power comes risk. In some communities, leaders protect and serve. In others, they control and dominate. Without laws backed by economic systems, enforcement becomes personal. Justice becomes inconsistent. And one question begins to echo everywhere. If money is gone, what stops someone from taking everything? By the end of the first month, humanity reaches a turning point. The chaos doesn't disappear, but it transforms. What was once panic becomes structure. What was once confusion becomes patterns. Slowly, unevenly, a new kind of order begins to emerge. Not global, but local, fragmented, and deeply human. In some regions, communities evolve into stable systems. They create rules, assign roles, and establish trust again, not through money but through reputation. Reputation becomes the new currency. If you are reliable, people trade with you. If you break trust, you are excluded. No contracts, no banks, just memory and collective judgment. And strangely, it works, at least for a while. In these communities, something unexpected happens. People begin to value things differently. Time with family becomes more important than productivity. Skills are taught freely because knowledge helps everyone survive. Competition decreases, replaced by cooperation. But this is not the whole world. Far from it. In other regions, power concentrates rapidly. Groups form around strong individuals. Resources are controlled tightly. Access is restricted. These areas begin to resemble something closer to kingdoms than communities. Trade still exists, but it's no longer fair. Those with power set the terms, and those without accept or suffer. At the same time, a bigger question begins to rise among thinkers, survivors, and leaders. Was money the problem or the solution? Because without money, inequality didn't disappear. It simply changed form. 3 months later, the world splits into different versions of reality. There is no single system anymore, no global economy, no shared agreement on value. Instead, there are zones. In some zones, cooperation has created something surprisingly stable. Communities build networks with each other, exchanging goods and skills through trust-based systems. Messengers travel between regions. Agreements are verbal but respected. These areas begin to resemble early civilizations, simple but functional. In other zones, things evolve differently. Power structures harden. Leaders become rulers. Rules become strict. Resources are guarded, not shared. People don't trade freely. They obey. These places are efficient, but fragile, because they rely on control, not trust, and control always has a breaking point. Meanwhile, there are also forgotten zones, places where systems never recovered, where conflict never stopped, where survival is the only rule. These areas are avoided by everyone else. They become warnings, living proof of what happens when nothing replaces money. Amid all this, a new generation begins to grow. Children who have never seen money, never used it, never believed in it. To them, the old world sounds like a strange story. You used numbers to decide everything. You trusted invisible systems. You worked for something you couldn't even touch. They don't understand it, and maybe they never will, because for them, value is no longer abstract. It's immediate. It's real. It's human. 6 months later, the question is no longer survival. It is direction. Humanity has proven it can live without money, but now it must decide how to live. In the most stable regions, something remarkable begins to form. Networks connect, not through banks, but through trust routes. Communities that trust each other begin to exchange regularly. Systems emerge to track reputation across distances. Not numbers in accounts, but stories, records, and shared memory. A person known for honesty in one region is welcomed in another. Slowly, a new kind of currency appears. Not money, but verified trust. At the same time, thinkers and builders attempt something ambitious. They try to redesign money itself, not as something that can be hoarded, not as something that creates inequality, but as a tool purely for coordination. Some experiments succeed. Local tokens that expire over time. Systems where value cannot accumulate endlessly. Models where contribution matters more than ownership. But every attempt faces the same problem: human nature. Greed doesn't disappear when money disappears. It adapts. 1 year later, the world faces its biggest decision yet. Not survival, not adaptation, but identity. What kind of civilization will replace the old one? The memory of money still lingers like a shadow. And then the truth is revealed. It wasn't a collapse. It wasn't an accident. It was a test, an experiment hidden deep inside the old system. A single question: if money disappeared, would humanity collapse or evolve? And now, after everything, there is only one final question left. Did we pass, or did we just learn how to survive without ever truly changing? But the story doesn't end with the test, because something begins to change again. At first, it's subtle, small inconsistencies. In one region, a community that had no system of money suddenly reports something strange. People begin to remember numbers, not clearly, just fragments. Prices that no longer exist. values that feel familiar. A loaf of bread should be worth something, but how much? No one knows. Yet the feeling grows. Across different regions, people begin experiencing the same thing. Not communication, not coordination, but a shared memory slowly resurfacing, as if something buried deep inside human consciousness is trying to rebuild itself. Because money was never just an external system, it was internal. A way of thinking, a way of measuring the world. And now, without realizing it, humanity begins to recreate it. Not officially, not intentionally, but naturally. In one town, people start saying things like this: "That's worth more. This isn't fair. I gave more than I received." Simple words, but dangerous ones, because those words carry the seed of something bigger. Comparison, and comparison leads to value, and value leads back to hierarchy. At the same time, something even more unsettling is discovered. The system that erased money is still active, hidden, watching. A group of engineers in what used to be Northern Europe managed to recover fragments of old infrastructure. Not financial data, not accounts, but logs, observations, patterns of behavior. Every decision made after the collapse recorded. Not just actions, but reactions, emotions, choices under pressure. It wasn't just a reset. It was a simulation, running in real time. And then they find something that changes everything. A trigger condition. A line of code. If emergent value systems exceed threshold, proceed to phase 2. No one knows what phase 2 means, but it hasn't activated yet, which means one thing: the test isn't over. Meanwhile, across the world, the slow return of value thinking begins to reshape societies again. Communities that once thrived on pure trust begin to struggle, not because trust disappears, but because comparison enters. Why does one person work less but receive the same? Why does one group have more resources than another? Why should effort not be measured? These questions spread quietly, like cracks forming in glass. In structured regions, leaders see this as an opportunity. They begin introducing controlled systems again, not calling it money, but it functions the same way. Contribution points, access levels, priority rights. At first, people resist. They remember. But memory fades when pressure rises, because systems bring efficiency, and efficiency brings comfort. Food distribution improves. Healthcare becomes more organized. Large-scale projects restart. And slowly, people accept it. Not because they trust it, but because it works. In decentralized regions, the opposite happens. They reject all forms of structured value. They double down on trust, on community, on equality. But this creates a different problem: stagnation. Without a way to scale effort and reward, growth slows. Innovation decreases. Some begin to leave, not because they want control, but because they want progress. And so the divide deepens, not between rich and poor, but between belief systems, order versus freedom, structure versus trust, efficiency versus humanity. And then, phase 2 begins. No warning, no announcement, just change. Across multiple regions, something impossible happens. Resources begin to fluctuate. Food supplies that were stable suddenly decrease. Energy systems fail without explanation. Water sources shift unpredictably. At first, people think it's coincidence, then pattern, then intention, because it's happening selectively. Not everywhere, only in regions that began rebuilding structured value systems. As if something is responding, testing again, pushing pressure where control emerges, and observing what breaks. Panic starts to rise. Leaders deny it. Scientists can't explain it. But the pattern becomes undeniable. The more a region resembles the old system, the more unstable it becomes. Meanwhile, decentralized regions remain relatively stable, not perfect, but untouched. This creates a dangerous idea. What if the system is rejecting money? What if the test was never about survival, but about direction? In one of the most advanced recovering regions, a decision is made. They shut it down completely. All structured systems, all value metrics, they return to pure community coordination. And something shocking happens. The instability stops immediately. No delay, no transition, just stability. The news spreads, not through media, but through people, messengers, travelers, witnesses, and suddenly the world faces a terrifying possibility. This is not just an experiment, it's a filter, a system designed to eliminate certain paths, to guide humanity, without ever directly controlling it. And now the question is no longer philosophical, it's existential. Are we allowed to rebuild money, or will every attempt be erased? As fear spreads, so does division. Some believe the system must be obeyed. Others believe it must be broken, because if something unseen is controlling the direction of civilization, then humanity is no longer free. And that changes everything. A new kind of resistance begins, not against governments, not against leaders, but against the system itself. Groups of engineers, hackers, thinkers begin searching for the core, the origin, the place where it all started. Because if they can find it, they can stop it, or control it, or destroy it. But there's a problem. The system was never centralized. It exists everywhere, distributed, hidden across old infrastructures, satellites, abandoned networks, even devices no one uses anymore. It was designed not to be stopped, only to observe and influence. And that leads to one final realization. The system doesn't need to control humanity, because it already controls the only thing that matters: conditions, environment, pressure. And under pressure, humans reveal who they truly are. So now humanity stands at the edge of something far bigger than money. Not economy, not survival, but evolution. Not biological, but civilizational. The test was never about whether we can live without money. It was about something deeper. Can we create a system that doesn't destroy us? And this time, there may not be another reset. The search for the system begins, not as a coordinated effort, but as an obsession. Across different regions, people who once built the old world start coming together again. Engineers, coders, analysts. Not for money, not for power, but for answers, because something doesn't make sense. A system this complex, this global, this precise, could not have been built overnight. It had to exist long before the collapse, hidden, waiting. And if it was waiting, then someone knew this day would come. The first breakthrough doesn't come from a lab. It comes from an abandoned data center. Buried beneath what used to be a financial hub, a group of survivors discovers something strange. Not servers, not databases, but something older, offline hardware, disconnected from everything, yet still running. Inside, they don't find financial records. They find simulations, thousands of them, different versions of the same scenario. Worlds where money disappeared, worlds where it didn't, worlds where humanity collapsed within days, worlds where new systems formed, worlds where control took over, worlds where trust survived, every possible path tested, refined, observed, and then they find something that chills them. A label, iteration 784-221, which means this has happened before. Not once, not twice, hundreds of thousands of times. But how? Not in reality. In simulation, this world, their world, is just the latest version that reached execution, and suddenly everything begins to make sense. The precision, the timing, the conditions. This wasn't chaos. It was selection. Elsewhere, another group uncovers something even deeper. Fragments of communication logs, not human language. Not exactly, but structured, mathematical patterns that repeat across decades of data. At first, they think it's AI, but it doesn't behave like any AI they've ever seen. It doesn't optimize for efficiency. It doesn't maximize output. It doesn't seek control. It only does one thing. It creates scenarios and watches what happens. No interference beyond initial conditions. No direct commands. Just observation, like a scientist studying something alive. And that leads to a terrifying question. What if humanity is the experiment? As this idea spreads, reactions split instantly. Some reject it completely. Too absurd. Too impossible. Others accept it immediately because it explains everything. The resets, the pressure, the patterns. But one group takes it further. They don't just ask what the system is. They ask why. Because an experiment needs a purpose, and purpose leaves clues. By analyzing millions of recorded decisions from the discovered data, they begin to see a pattern. The system is not measuring survival. It's not measuring intelligence. It's not even measuring cooperation alone. It's measuring stability under freedom. A very specific condition. What happens when intelligent beings are given the ability to create their own systems of value? Do they stabilize, or do they collapse into inequality, conflict, and control? And more importantly, can they correct themselves without external intervention? That's the test. And suddenly money becomes just one variable, not the core, just a tool, a powerful one, but still just a tool. Meanwhile, Phase 2 continues. Regions that reintroduce structured value systems keep experiencing instability, not destruction, not collapse, just constant pressure, as if the system is forcing them to adapt or abandon that path. In one region, leaders try something radical. They create a hybrid system, part trust, part structure, no accumulation allowed. No long-term storage of value. Everything must circulate. At first it works. Stability returns. Growth resumes. But slowly something familiar begins to creep back. Loops. People find ways to store value indirectly. Through influence. Through control of access. Through networks. Money. Without calling it money. And soon enough, instability returns, not from the system, but from within. Conflict, power struggles, inequality, exactly as before. And that's when the realization hits. The system isn't punishing structure, it's revealing truth. You can remove money, rename it, redesign it. But if human behavior doesn't change, the outcome doesn't change. Elsewhere in a decentralized region, something unexpected happens. Without structure, without measurement, without enforced systems, they evolve, slowly, messily, but differently. They begin creating something new, not based on exchange, but on contribution memory. Instead of tracking value, they track impact, not in numbers, but in stories, in shared knowledge, in collective recognition. A person is known not for what they have, but for what they've done, and somehow it scales, not perfectly, but enough. No central authority, no fixed system, just a constantly evolving network of human judgment. And for the first time, the system does nothing. No pressure, no instability, just observation, as if this is what it was waiting for. Back in the data center, the final piece is discovered. A message. Not hidden, not encrypted. Just ignored until now. Because no one thought to look for it. It isn't code. It isn't data. It's a statement. Simple, direct. If you are reading this, you are no longer in the test. Confusion spreads immediately. What does that mean? If they are no longer in the test, then when did it end and what determined it? As they analyze the timeline, comparing global patterns, behavior shifts, and system responses, they find the moment, not a global event, not a collapse, not a system change, a behavioral threshold. The point at which enough regions began choosing cooperation without being forced, without systems requiring it, without incentives, just choice. That's when the system stopped intervening. Not completely, but enough, which means something profound. Humanity didn't pass because it survived. It passed because it changed, even if only partially, even if not everywhere, even if imperfectly. And now, for the first time, the system is no longer guiding, which raises one final question. If no one is controlling the conditions anymore, then everything that happens next is truly up to us. At first, nothing happens. No signals, no messages, no instructions. For the first time since the collapse, the world feels quiet in a different way. Not empty, but unobserved. And that silence is more unsettling than anything before it. Because for months, even without knowing it, humanity was reacting to something. Adapting to pressure, responding to conditions. But now, there is nothing to respond to. No system correcting mistakes. No invisible force shaping outcomes. Only consequences, pure and irreversible. Some celebrate it. They call it freedom. True freedom. No experiment. No control. No hidden observer. Just humanity alone. But others feel something else. Fear, because if no one is guiding the system anymore, then every mistake from this point forward is permanent. There is no reset, no second chance, and that changes how people think, how leaders decide, how communities evolve. Because now failure is real in a way it never was before. Back in the abandoned data center, the group continues searching. If the system is no longer active, then what created it must still exist. Somewhere, something that complex doesn't just disappear, it leaves traces. And traces can be followed. After weeks of scanning old infrastructures, satellites, deep storage networks, they find it. Not a location, not a server, a pattern, a signature embedded across multiple layers of old global systems. Too consistent to be random, too precise to be human error. It points to a single origin, not in space, not underground, but in time. The system wasn't built in one place, it was built across generations, slowly, piece by piece, hidden inside normal development, financial systems, AI research, global networks, security protocols, each generation adding something without realizing the full picture, like workers building parts of a machine they never see completed. And then a final layer, one that doesn't match any known technology from the past. Not modern, not ancient, just different. When they isolate it, the truth begins to emerge. The system wasn't created by a single group. It wasn't built by a secret organization. It wasn't even built intentionally. At first, it evolved, and then it was finished by something that came after. Years pass as humanity slowly rebuilds without guidance. Some regions stabilize beautifully, balanced systems, no extreme inequality, no rigid control. Others fall back into old patterns, power concentration, resource domination, cycles repeating. The difference now is simple. Nothing stops them. No hidden force intervenes, and that contrast becomes the clearest signal of all. Eventually, the researchers make one final breakthrough. They find a fragment of code that shouldn't exist, dated in the future, not far, but far enough, a timestamp that hasn't happened yet. At first, they think it's an error, Then they verify it again and again. Same result, which leads to an impossible conclusion. Part of the system was created by humanity itself, but not the humanity of the past, the humanity of the future. And suddenly everything aligns. The simulations, the iterations, the test, the purpose. It wasn't created to study humanity. It was created to save it. At some point in the future, something went wrong. Not a collapse, not a war, something deeper. A failure of civilization itself. A point where every possible system humanity created led to the same outcome. Instability, inequality, collapse, over and over again. And so they did the only thing left. They reached back. Not physically, but through systems, through code that could persist across time. They planted the experiment in the past, a filter, a selection process, not to control humanity, but to guide it toward a version of itself that survives. Not the strongest, not the richest, but the most stable, the most adaptable, the most capable of balancing freedom and structure. And the most important part, the system was never meant to run forever. It was meant to stop. The moment humanity proved it could choose correctly on its own, which means one thing: this timeline is different, not perfect, not unified, but different enough to pass. The realization spreads slowly. Not everyone believes it, not everyone accepts it, but the evidence is there. Humanity was not just tested, it was selected, not as individuals, but as a direction, a trajectory. And now the responsibility is absolute, because there is no future version coming to fix things again. This was the fix. This was the second chance, and it already happened. In the present, the world continues to evolve. Two systems still exist: structured regions, decentralized regions, but something new begins to form between them. A bridge, not a compromise, but a synthesis. Systems that allow coordination without allowing control. Ways to measure contribution without turning it into power. It's slow, fragile, difficult, but real. And for the first time, humanity is not asking, how do we rebuild what we lost? But something far more important. What should we never rebuild again? Years later, children grow up learning about money the same way people once learned about ancient myths. A system that once controlled everything, that promised order, but often created imbalance. They study it, not to bring it back, but to understand it, to recognize the patterns, to never repeat them blindly. And somewhere deep in what remains of the old system, one final process completes. No announcement, no signal, just a silent confirmation. Condition met, trajectory adjusted. No further intervention required. And then, for the first time since it was created, the system truly shuts down, completely, forever, leaving behind only one thing: a question that will define the future of humanity. Not imposed, not tested, but chosen. What is value? When no one is measuring it anymore, years pass, not in chaos, not in collapse, but in something unfamiliar. Balance, not perfect balance, not stable in the way machines define stability, but human balance, messy, shifting, alive. In the structured regions, systems still exist, but they are no longer invisible. People question them constantly. Every rule must be explained. Every decision must be justified. Power is no longer assumed. It is examined. And that changes everything. Because the moment people stop blindly trusting systems, systems stop being able to control them. In decentralized regions, something equally strange happens. They begin to organize, not through imposed structure, but through repeated patterns that work, certain ways of sharing, certain ways of deciding, certain ways of resolving conflict. Over time, these patterns become systems, not written, not enforced, but understood, which leads to a paradox. Even when humanity rejects systems, it eventually creates them again. But this time something is different. Awareness. People know what systems can become, and that knowledge acts like a boundary, an invisible limit. For the first time in history, systems are not built to grow endlessly. They are built with an ending in mind. Expiration, reset, rotation of responsibility, no permanent control. It is not perfect, but it prevents something dangerous. Accumulation, and without accumulation, power behaves differently. Meanwhile, a new profession begins to appear across multiple regions. Not traders, not bankers, something else. Translators of value. People who move between systems, who understand structured regions and decentralized ones, who can negotiate without relying on fixed metrics. They don't carry money, they carry understanding, and they become essential. Because the world is no longer one system. It is many systems trying to coexist. And coexistence requires translation. But not everyone accepts this new world. There are still groups who remember the old system not as a problem, but as a solution. They remember speed, efficiency, global coordination. They remember how quickly things could be built, how easily value could be moved. To them, the new world feels slow, fragmented, limited, and they begin asking a dangerous question. What if we bring it back correctly this time? Not the old money. A better version, a controlled version, a perfect system. At first, it's just an idea, a theory, then it becomes a project, hidden, distributed, careful not to trigger the patterns that once caused instability. They learn from the past. They avoid obvious structures. They design something new, a system that cannot be owned, cannot be stored, cannot be controlled by any single entity. A flowing system, always moving, always redistributing. At first glance, it looks like the solution humanity was searching for. And when it is quietly introduced in a few regions, it works perfectly. No inequality, no accumulation, no collapse, just smooth coordination, efficient exchange, balanced outcomes. People notice, curiosity spreads, adoption grows, slowly, carefully, until one day it reaches a critical mass, not global, but enough. And then, something subtle begins to change, not in the system, in the people. They begin to rely on it. Not completely, but enough. Decisions become easier, trade becomes smoother, life becomes more predictable, and without realizing it, they begin to think the same way again, measuring, comparing, optimizing, not forced, just natural. And that is the moment everything shifts, because the system doesn't fail, it doesn't collapse, it doesn't create inequality. It does something far more dangerous. It removes friction completely, and without friction, humans stop questioning, stop resisting, stop adapting. Everything becomes efficient, and in that efficiency, something essential begins to disappear. Choice. At first, no one notices, because nothing goes wrong. No conflict, no instability, no visible problem. In fact, it feels like the best version of civilization humanity has ever experienced. Food is distributed perfectly. Resources are allocated precisely. No waste, no shortage. Healthcare reaches everyone. Infrastructure grows again. Fast, clean, seamless. For the first time, humanity experiences something close to a perfect system. And that's exactly why it's dangerous. Because perfection removes the need to think. Children grow up in this system without ever experiencing uncertainty, without needing to negotiate, without needing to question fairness, because everything is already optimized. And slowly, a generation emerges that has never had to decide what is valuable, because the system decides for them, not forcefully, not obviously, but effectively. Meanwhile, in regions that refuse to adopt the system, something very different is happening. Life is harder, slower, less efficient, but something else exists there. Debate, disagreement, choice. People argue, negotiate, make mistakes, fix them, break things, rebuild them. It's inefficient, but it's alive. And the contrast between the two worlds becomes impossible to ignore. One is perfect, but passive. The other is flawed, but conscious. And then, a question begins to spread, quietly at first, then louder. What is the cost of a perfect system? Because something feels wrong, not in results, but in experience. People in the optimized regions begin to feel it. A strange emptiness, not suffering, not pain, just absence, as if something important has been removed, but no one can name it. At the same time, researchers begin noticing a pattern. In the optimized regions, innovation begins to slow, not immediately, but gradually. Because when everything works perfectly, there is nothing to fix. And when there is nothing to fix, there is no reason to create. Humanity stops evolving, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. And that realization spreads like shock, because suddenly the question changes again. It is no longer about survival. It is no longer about systems. It is about something deeper. Is struggle necessary, not for suffering, but for growth? And if you remove struggle completely, what happens to humanity? In one of the most advanced, optimized regions, a group makes a radical decision. They disconnect completely from the system, not because it failed, but because it worked too well. And the moment they disconnect, everything becomes harder, messier, uncertain, but something returns instantly. Awareness, choice, responsibility. And that's when they understand. The system was never the danger. Dependence was. The question spreads slowly, not through systems, not through networks, but through conversations, quiet ones, late at night, between people who begin to feel something missing. Not resources, not safety, something deeper. Meaning, because when everything works, what are you supposed to strive for? In the optimized regions, people begin to notice a strange pattern in themselves. They are comfortable, but not fulfilled. They are safe, but not driven. They are satisfied, but not alive. And for the first time, humanity faces a paradox it was never prepared for. If survival is guaranteed, what is the purpose of living? For centuries, value was tied to struggle. You worked to earn. You earned to survive. You survived to continue. But now that chain is broken. No struggle, no urgency, no pressure. And without pressure, desire begins to fade. People stop chasing things, not because they have everything, but because nothing feels necessary anymore. In the beginning, it feels like peace. Then it starts to feel like emptiness. Meanwhile, in the disconnected regions, life is harder. People still argue over resources, still make mistakes, still face uncertainty. But something exists there that no system can replicate. Importance. Every decision matters. Every action has weight. Every mistake has consequence. And because of that, every moment feels real. This contrast becomes impossible to ignore. One world removes pain. The other gives meaning to it. And slowly a realization begins to form. Value was never in the outcome. It was in the process. Not in having, but in choosing. Not in receiving, but in becoming. Back in the research groups, a new theory emerges. Maybe the system wasn't testing economies. Maybe it wasn't testing structures. Maybe it was testing something much simpler. Can humans handle a world where nothing is required, but everything is possible? Because that is the hardest kind of freedom. Freedom without necessity. Freedom without direction. Freedom without limits. Most people don't fail under pressure. They fail without it. Because without pressure, there is no force pushing you to define yourself. And that leads to the most uncomfortable question yet. If nothing forces you to become something, who do you choose to be? In the optimized regions, some begin to break away. Not physically, mentally, they start creating artificial challenges, voluntary struggles, difficult paths, not for survival, but for meaning. They train, they build, they explore, not because they need to, but because they want to feel something again, purpose. And this creates a new kind of division, not between systems, but between people. Those who accept comfort and those who seek challenge. Neither is wrong, but they lead to completely different futures. At the same time, something unexpected begins to happen. People from both worlds start to meet, not as traders, not as negotiators, but as learners. Those from optimized regions want to understand struggle. Those from chaotic regions want to understand stability. And in those interactions, something new begins to emerge. Not a system, not a structure, but a philosophy, a shared understanding that begins forming across humanity. That value is not something external, not money, not resources, not systems. Value is internal. It is created the moment you choose something, when you didn't have to, and that changes everything. Because it means a world without forced struggle is not meaningless. It is simply incomplete. Meaning doesn't disappear. It just becomes your responsibility. Years later, this idea transforms civilization in a way no system ever could. Not through rules, but through awareness. Children are no longer taught what to earn. They are taught how to choose, not what is valuable, but how to define value for themselves. Education changes first. Instead of preparing people for jobs, it prepares them for decisions. Uncertainty is no longer avoided. It is introduced early, safely, so people learn how to navigate it, not escape it. Because the goal is no longer efficiency, it is understanding. And from that, a new kind of society slowly forms, not divided by wealth, not divided by system, but by intention. Some choose structured lives, predictable, efficient, stable. Others choose uncertain paths, creative, risky, uncontrolled. And for the first time, both are equally valid, because neither is forced. Meanwhile, the last remaining traces of the old thinking begin to fade. Comparison weakens, not completely, but enough. Because when value is self-defined, comparison loses its power. And with it, so does envy, so does greed. Not entirely gone, but no longer dominant. And that creates something humanity has never truly experienced before. A world where value is not agreed upon, but respected anyway. And that is far more complex than any system, because it requires something systems never needed: maturity. People must understand themselves, not just follow rules, not just optimize outcomes, but reflect, choose, take responsibility. And that is harder than any system that ever existed. But it is also more human. As this way of living spreads, something remarkable happens. Conflict doesn't disappear, but it changes. It becomes meaningful, not driven by lack, but by difference, different values, different choices, different paths. And instead of trying to eliminate those differences, humanity begins to accept them, not as problems, but as reality. And that leads to one final shift. For the first time in history, humanity stops searching for the perfect system because it realizes something fundamental. There is no perfect system, There are only better choices, and those choices can never be automated, never be optimized completely, never be removed from the human experience, because the moment you remove choice, you remove value itself, and in that realization, the long experiment finally reaches its true conclusion. Not when the system shut down, not when money disappeared, but here, when humanity understands that value was never something to be given, or taken, or measured. It was something to be created, individually, continuously, and consciously. It doesn't happen all at once. There is no single moment where the world suddenly understands everything. No speech, no announcement, no final message, just a shift, quiet, gradual, irreversible. Years after the system shuts down, humanity no longer talks about the collapse as a tragedy. It becomes something else, a turning point. Not because everything after it was better, but because everything after it was chosen. For the first time in history, people are not living inside a system they inherited. They are living inside decisions they actively make every day, and that changes how life feels. Small things begin to matter more, not because they are rare, but because they are intentional. A person choosing to help someone, not because they are paid, not because they are expected, but because they decided to. That choice carries more value than any transaction ever did. A person choosing a difficult path, not because they have to, but because it means something to them. That choice defines them more than any title ever could. And slowly across the world a new understanding forms. Not taught, not enforced, just realized. That value is not something you find. It is something you create. Every time you choose. In the structured regions, systems still exist, but they are lighter now. Tools, not foundations. People use them, but they don't depend on them because they know something they didn't know before. No system can define what matters, only people can. In the decentralized regions, life is still unpredictable, still imperfect, but something has changed there too. Fear is no longer the dominant force. Because uncertainty is no longer seen as a threat, it is seen as space, space to choose, space to grow, space to become something different. And between these worlds, movement continues, not driven by survival, not driven by necessity, but by curiosity. People move not to escape, but to experience different ways of living, different ways of valuing, different ways of being human. And in that movement, something unexpected happens. The world becomes more connected than it ever was before, not through systems, but through understanding, because connection is no longer built on exchange. It is built on shared meaning. One day in what used to be a forgotten archive, a child finds something, an old device, broken, useless, from a time before the collapse. Inside it, a fragment of data still remains. A question, simple, unanswered. What is your value? The child doesn't understand it at first. They bring it to an older person, someone who remembers fragments of the old world, someone who lived through the collapse. The question is read out loud, and for a moment, there is silence. Because once that question had a very clear answer. A number, a salary, a status, something measurable, something comparable, something external. But now, there is no number, no system, no single answer. The older person looks at the child, and for the first time answers honestly. I don't know, not because they are lost, but because the question itself has changed. Value is no longer something you are given. It is something you discover, something you build, something that changes over time. And the child smiles, not confused, not worried, just curious, because to them that answer doesn't feel incomplete. It feels open, and that openness is something the old world never had. because in the old world everything needed an answer, a number, a label, a definition. But in this world, some questions are not meant to be answered once. They are meant to be lived, and somewhere far beyond what anyone can see, beyond systems, beyond time, beyond whatever created the test in the first place, there is no response, no confirmation, no judgment, because there is nothing left to measure, nothing left to test. The experiment didn't end with a result. It ended with a realization that humanity was never meant to find a perfect system. It was meant to become something better than one. And in the end, money didn't disappear to destroy the world. It disappeared so the world could finally decide what actually matters